Family disowned me after my sister framed me for theft, but now years later begging me for help. So here's the thing. I'm not exactly my family's pride and joy. Never have been. You've got my sister Jessica, total golden child, practically perfect at everything she touches. And then there's me, struggling to get a small business off the ground, barely keeping up with the bills. My parents? Well, let's just say they've always been a little more invested in her success than in mine. Typical, right? Growing up, Jessica was always the one who could do no wrong. She had straight A's, went to the right schools, landed a good job right out of college, then started her own business that just took off. And here I was, scraping together savings, pulling ridiculous hours trying to keep my small shop alive. My store's no high-end boutique or anything. It's just a little place where I sell handmade stuff and whatever other creative things I can manage to pull together. And to be real with you, I was struggling. Not exactly the cash cow my family hoped for, but hey, I was making an honest go of it. I guess that doesn't matter when you're comparing yourself to a sister who's basically a hometown success story. Things started getting bad for me after a few rough years in a row. I'd had some bad luck with suppliers, lost a couple of big orders, and then COVID hit, and honestly, my business never really recovered after that. I tried everything to keep the place going. New products, discounts, promos on every social media channel I could think of. But nothing was working. I was watching my business fall apart piece by piece, and I was barely holding it together. So, at my lowest, I finally decided to ask for help. Not exactly a proud moment, but you do what you gotta do, right? I thought my family might understand since they'd always preached about helping each other out. Guess I was wrong. When I went to my parents, they basically told me to suck it up and figure it out on my own. They said something like, if you can't make it work by now, maybe it's time to rethink things. Real encouraging, right? But Jessica overheard, and she swooped in with an offer. She had that I'll save the day look on her face, which already put me on edge. She said if I was serious about fixing my situation, I could come back home and work for her business while staying rent-free with her and her husband. In return, she'd front me some cash to help keep my shop open. I'm not gonna lie, I was desperate, so I considered it. But I also knew Jessica well enough to know that nothing is ever that simple with her. She loves being in control, loves being the one who people turn to when they're in trouble. I could already imagine her using this favor to lord over me forever. But my options were limited, and the thought of saving my shop made it seem worth it, so I said yes. Moving back into my hometown felt like a slap in the face. Here I was, nearly 30 years old, dragging myself back to my family because my business was crumbling. Meanwhile, Jessica was living in this beautiful house with her perfect little life. It was like I'd stepped into a reality show where I was the before and she was the after. The moment I walked in, my mom was on me about how I could have done more with my life if I'd just followed Jessica's example. I kept my mouth shut, though, because honestly, I needed them. Jessica wasted no time putting me to work either. She had me doing all kinds of random tasks for her business. Inventory, packing, running errands, stuff that had nothing to do with why I was there. It felt like she was showing off, like I was supposed to see how successful she was and feel grateful that she'd even thought to help me out. And maybe I was supposed to feel embarrassed, but mostly I felt angry. Now, I'd expected some tension. We'd never exactly been close, but this was something else. I swear every time she'd help me, it came with this little jab. She'd say stuff like, I know it's tough for you, with that fake sympathetic look, or maybe if you'd planned better, things would be different. I just kept swallowing it because, again, I had no choice. I needed that money if my shop was going to survive. After a couple of weeks, Jessica finally came through with the money. She transferred a chunk into my account, and for a split second, I thought maybe she was actually doing something decent. I didn't ask any questions, just took it as a lifeline. I thought, okay, maybe I can make this work, get back on my feet, and then I can finally get out of here and back to my life. But something didn't sit right. Every time I'd bring up my business, she'd get this smug look on her face, almost like she was waiting for something to go wrong. I brushed it off as just her usual attitude. But then, the weird stuff started. One day I went to pay a bill for my shop, and the transaction was declined. I checked my account, and every cent was gone. Not just the money Jessica had transferred, but all the funds I'd managed to scrape together, completely wiped out. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. I called the bank in a panic, thinking maybe it was a mistake or some kind of fraud. But the bank guy on the other end just tells me calmly that the money had been transferred out and that there was nothing suspicious on their end. I spent hours on the phone trying to track it down. I didn't understand how this could happen. That's when it hit me. Jessica had my account info. When I moved in, She'd helped me set up everything, even insisted on handling some of my paperwork. She had every single detail about my finances, which meant she could move money around however she wanted. It was all starting to click, but I still wasn't ready to believe it. I mean, I knew Jessica could be petty, controlling even, but stealing from me? That was a whole other level. I kept telling myself it couldn't be true, that maybe I just misplaced something or missed a payment. But deep down I knew better. She was capable of more than just being a pain. I knew it, but I didn't want to admit it. So I waited, hoping maybe there'd be some kind of explanation, maybe even an apology if she'd made a mistake. But instead I got the opposite. The next morning my mom came storming into my room yelling about how I was a disgrace to the family. She called me a thief, said I'd betrayed everyone. Apparently Jessica had gone to my parents with proof that I'd been stealing money from them to fund my failing business. She made it sound like I'd just been using everyone this whole time. I barely even processed what was happening. I was in shock, just standing there listening to my mom go off, calling me a liar, and worse things I'd rather not repeat. The only thing I could think was, why would she do this? That was when I realized Jessica never intended to help me. She'd set me up from the start. After my mom's blow-up, I barely had time to collect myself before my dad got involved. He came storming in, demanding to know where the money was. There was no talking, no chance to defend myself. It was just accusation after accusation. They had it all mapped out in their heads. I'd come back to mooch off Jessica, I was using everyone to keep my failing business afloat, and now they finally saw my true colors. I felt trapped, like everything had already been decided before I even opened my mouth. And Jessica? She stood there, leaning against the wall with her arms crossed, looking calm and concerned, like she was the victim here. It was so perfectly staged that I almost believed her myself. She had evidence, some printouts, probably showing the money that was transferred into my account and then back out, and she handed it all over to my parents, all wrapped up with her little narrative about how I was taking advantage of the family. But it was worse than just my parents being mad. They were disgusted. They looked at me like I was the lowest scum on the planet. My mom even said, "You know, I always hoped you'd turn things around. But now? I wish we'd never helped you at all." I can still hear her words echoing in my head. I felt like I was sinking, unable to catch my breath. So, they packed up my things. I didn't even get a say in it. My mom went through my stuff, tossed everything in a suitcase, and told me to get out. I watched in silence, completely stunned. They wouldn't even let me explain that the money Jessica had given me was supposed to help me stay afloat. Every time I tried to say anything, they'd cut me off, saying, "Don't make it worse for yourself." In the middle of it, I tried to look at Jessica, just hoping she'd have some flicker of guilt or something. But she wouldn't meet my eyes. She kept her gaze on the floor, probably to keep up her innocent act, but I knew it was because she couldn't look at me. She knew exactly what she'd done. When they were done throwing my stuff together, my dad handed me a bus ticket out of town. He told me I wasn't welcome back, that I was a shame to the family. It hit me that they weren't just kicking me out, they were cutting me off completely. My whole life I'd been on thin ice with them, and this was the last straw. It was only when I stepped out of the house that it all really hit me. I'd gone from barely hanging on to being completely left with nothing in less than 24 hours. And what's worse? This was all her doing. Jessica had set me up, lied through her teeth, and made me look like a criminal, just so she could look like the good one in the family. She was the one who wiped my account. She was the one who put all the blame on me, and she got away with it. The first night, I stayed at some rundown motel on the edge of town, trying to figure out what I was going to do next. It was cheap, which was the only good thing about it. The bed was lumpy, there were stains on the walls, and the whole place smelled like a mix of bleach and regret. But I couldn't afford anything better. I lay there staring at the ceiling, replaying everything in my mind, trying to make sense of it all. How could Jessica do this? I mean, yeah, we weren't close, but this was something else. It wasn't just jealousy. It was like she'd planned this from the start. I thought back to all the little comments she'd made, all the digs about my business failing and how I didn't plan well enough. She'd been laying the groundwork for weeks, maybe months. It was like a sick game to her. The next day, I tried to call my parents. I was hoping maybe, just maybe, they'd come around if I could talk to them without Jessica around. But they didn't answer. I left voicemails, sent texts, even tried calling from a different number. Nothing. They'd completely cut me off. It felt like a punch to the gut, realizing that they'd written me off just like that, without even giving me a chance. At that point, I didn't know where else to turn. My friends were mostly out of state or tied up with their own lives, and I didn't want to drag them into this mess. Plus, let's be real, I was embarrassed. Admitting that my own family had turned against me was like confessing that I'd failed on every level. I mean, who gets kicked out by their own parents at almost 30? Eventually, I decided to find work nearby and just try to rebuild, no matter how slow or hard it was. I knew it wasn't going to be easy, but what choice did I have? I started hitting up local businesses, looking for anything that would pay, even if it was just enough to cover food and rent for a tiny apartment. My pride was already in shreds, so I wasn't above taking whatever job I could get. It was a rough few weeks. There were nights where I barely ate, days where I was so exhausted from job hunting that I'd just collapse on the couch of whatever friend's place I'd managed to crash at. I felt like a ghost, moving through the motions, just trying to survive. The hardest part was knowing that all of this was because of Jessica. Every struggle, every bit of humiliation I went through, all because she'd decided to screw me over. And the worst part? My parents weren't just mad at me. They genuinely believed I was some kind of thief, someone who'd steal from their own family to keep a dying business afloat. They'd fed off every word Jessica had said, every proof she'd given them, like it was gospel truth. No questions, no doubts, just straight up belief in her story. And Jessica? She was probably sleeping like a baby with my family none the wiser. One evening, after another brutal day of job hunting, I sat down and just let myself be angry. Up until then, I'd been hurt. I'd been desperate, but now, I was just mad. It wasn't fair that she got to go on with her life, playing the hero while I was left scraping by. And the worst part was, she'd done it so smoothly, so flawlessly, that no one even suspected her. It was like she'd thought of everything, every tiny detail. But I made a decision that night. I wasn't going to let her win, not completely. If my family didn't want me, fine. If they believed her lies, that was on them. But I wasn't going to just disappear quietly. I was going to get back on my feet, with or without them. And one day, they were going to realize the truth. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was enough to keep me going. One thing I knew for sure. Jessica might have gotten her way this time, but it wouldn't be forever. After a while, I guess I just got used to scraping by. When you're forced into survival mode, your priorities change fast. The first few weeks after getting kicked out, I was too busy trying to get food on my plate and keep a roof over my head to think about anything else. I mean, it wasn't like I was homeless, but I was definitely one bad day away from it. I landed a few odd jobs here and there, mostly stuff like handing out flyers on the street, helping out with events, that sort of thing. Nothing permanent and definitely not enough to pay for an apartment. But eventually I caught a break at this small bakery. They needed someone to help out with morning shifts and cleaning, and I jumped on it. Was it my dream job? Not by a long shot, but it was honest work, and I needed every cent I could get my hands on. The first few weeks at the bakery were tough. I was waking up before sunrise, scrubbing floors, cleaning out ovens, even dealing with customers who seemed to think I was their personal punching bag. I won't lie, I felt humiliated. I went from being a small business owner with my own place to being the girl wiping tables in a bakery that barely even covered my basic bills. But I was determined not to let it break me. Over time, I settled into a bit of a routine. I'd work mornings at the bakery, then spend the afternoons at the library or on my phone, scouring job boards and trying to figure out a plan to get myself back on my feet. I spent hours researching everything from business grants to job training programs. It was exhausting, but it kept me focused. In some strange way, it was like having a project to work on. And I needed that. Something that reminded me I still had a future, that I wasn't just this failure my family had branded me as. Every now and then, I'd get this pang of anger thinking about Jessica. I mean, here I was, basically starting over from scratch while she got to live her cushy life, looking like a saint in the family's eyes. But I pushed those thoughts down because, honestly, it didn't help. Anger wasn't going to pay my rent or help me get my life back. I had to keep my head down, focus, and keep moving forward. No one was going to come save me, that much was clear. One day, I was helping a customer who'd come in every week like clockwork. He was this older guy, real friendly, always had a story to tell. I guess he saw something in me because, out of the blue, he asked, "What's a smart girl like you doing working in a bakery?" I shrugged it off, but he kept pressing. And before I knew it, I was telling him the short version of my story. I didn't get into all the drama with Jessica, but I mentioned losing my business and having to start over. Turns out, he was some retired business owner who'd seen it all. He gave me a few tips, told me about some free local business workshops, and even introduced me to a few people he thought might be able to help. That was a turning point for me. I started going to those workshops whenever I could, learning everything I'd done wrong with my shop and figuring out how to avoid those mistakes if I ever got another chance. Little by little, I started feeling like maybe I wasn't as much of a screw-up as I'd thought. About 6 months in, I got my first break. One of the guys I'd met through the workshops worked at a hardware store and mentioned they were hiring for some basic sales positions. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a steady paycheck. I went in for the interview and I guess they could see how badly I wanted it because I got the job. The hardware store was a whole different world from the bakery. For one, I was working regular hours and I even got weekends off. But more than that, I was learning again. I threw myself into the work, learning everything there was to know about tools, repair supplies, you name it. Before long, I was the go-to person for all the tough customer questions. The manager noticed my effort, and I started getting more shifts, a little more responsibility. It felt good, like I was finally doing something that mattered again. I won't pretend I was rolling in money, but I was finally stable. I saved up every extra dollar, started paying off the debt that was left over from my failed business, and even managed to put a little aside each month. I was rebuilding, piece by piece, and for the first time in a long time, I felt proud of myself. It was nothing flashy, but it was mine. Around this time, I heard through a mutual friend that Jessica was still talking about me. Apparently, she'd told some people that I was ungrateful and didn't appreciate the help she'd given me. She was spinning this story like she'd tried to save me, and I'd just thrown it back in her face. I guess she needed that narrative to feel good about herself, to keep up the image of the perfect sister. The old me would have been furious, but I just shrugged it off. I knew the truth, and that was enough for me. The hardware job wasn't exactly my dream either, but it was teaching me skills I'd never had before, and I started seeing possibilities I hadn't considered. I thought maybe I could stay in retail, maybe work my way up to a manager role someday, or even start a small handyman service if I could get some tools together. My whole perspective was shifting. It was like I'd finally learned that I didn't need my family's approval or validation to succeed. I just needed to keep showing up and putting in the work. In the evenings, I'd go home, make myself a simple dinner, and plan out my next steps. I still didn't have much of a social life, but I was okay with that. This was the first time in a long time that I felt like I had control over my life. I wasn't depending on anyone else, and I wasn't looking for handouts. If I failed again, it'd be on me, and I'd be okay with that. Slowly, I started reconnecting with a few friends I drifted away from. They didn't know the full story, but they knew I'd been through a rough patch. They were supportive, and it felt good to have people around me who weren't judging me or comparing me to my sister. They respected me for who I was, even if who I was wasn't perfect. It made me realize that maybe I'd put too much importance on my family's opinion in the first place. Not everyone saw me as a failure. Looking back, those months working at the hardware store, taking things day by day, were like therapy for me. I started seeing myself as someone who could succeed on their own terms, without needing to prove anything to anyone. I was healing from all the garbage my family had thrown my way, and I was finally finding some peace. By the end of that year, I was no longer that person who'd left home in shame. I'd rebuilt my life from scratch, and yeah, it wasn't perfect, but it was honest. I could look at myself in the mirror and actually feel proud, knowing I'd done it on my own. So there I was, going about my new routine and feeling like I'd finally reached some peace. And then, just like that, Jessica found a way to bulldoze her way back into my life. One day, out of nowhere, I get a message from Jessica's husband. I hadn't heard from him in ages, and honestly, I never even considered him someone I could count on. He was always just Jessica's husband to me. So I open the message, and it's this long-winded paragraph about how he doesn't know who else to turn to, and how they're going through a rough patch. I was just sitting there thinking, is this real? Now you reach out? At first, I ignored it. I figured they were in some minor argument, or he wanted advice on how to deal with her attitude or something. I mean, why else would he reach out to me? But he kept messaging, saying it was serious, and that he needed my help. I was torn because on one hand, I'd worked hard to cut them all off, but on the other hand, curiosity got the best of me. So finally, I caved and agreed to meet him. We arranged to meet up at a little cafe halfway between our places, and when I walked in, I didn't even recognize him at first. He looked rough, like he hadn't slept in days, eyes all bloodshot and twitchy. I almost felt bad for the guy. I sat down and he wasted no time jumping into this whole mess about how Jessica's business was tanking and she was in some serious trouble. He said she was mixed up in some shady stuff, and that if things went bad, they could lose everything. I was still in shock. Jessica's business? Failing? It was hard to imagine, but I guess it made sense. She was never as perfect as everyone thought, and honestly, I'd always wondered how she managed to keep up that successful image. But then, he dropped the real bomb. She'd been accused of selling counterfeit goods. He even mentioned that the police had been asking questions. Now, here's the part where I was supposed to feel sorry for her, right? Except I didn't. I actually felt this twisted satisfaction, knowing that her whole perfect world was cracking just like mine had. But what really got me was when her husband asked me if I could help her. Help her? I laughed, louder than I should have, probably because a few people looked over. He looked so desperate that I almost felt bad, but the irony was too rich. After everything she'd done, after turning my family against me, he wanted me to help? I flat out told him, she's got a lot of nerve thinking I'd help her after what she put me through. He looked down, like he'd expected that response. But then he started talking about how she was different now, how she was stressed, that she was barely keeping up, and that she was struggling to keep her business alive. He even tried to guilt trip me, saying that helping her would mean helping the whole family. If she goes down, they all go down, he said. I had to fight the urge to roll my eyes. I told him, I think they made it clear I wasn't part of the family a long time ago. But he wasn't done. He said something that really made me pause. He told me Jessica had been lying to my parents for years, not just about me, but about her whole business. He said she'd been using family money, convincing them to invest in her business while hiding the fact that she'd been selling knockoffs. Apparently, she'd made up this story that she was importing exclusive high-end products, and my parents had been funneling money her way because they thought they'd be getting a cut of her profits. They thought she was a success story, but she was using their money to fake it the entire time. I was stunned. Here I was, trying to rebuild my life from scratch, and my sister was living off family money, lying about her entire success. And now that her lies were catching up to her, she was hoping I'd come back and save her skin. My first instinct was to just walk out right there, but I held back. I wanted to hear every single detail about her mess. Her husband went on to explain that things had gotten so bad, she was facing real legal consequences. If the counterfeit products were traced back to her, she'd not only lose her business, but possibly face charges. He didn't say it outright, but it was clear. If Jessica went down, the family's reputation would take a massive hit. And here he was, practically begging me to help smooth things over with my parents. I sat there, trying to process everything. I'd spent so long being the black sheep, the disgrace, the one they'd shoved aside, and now they wanted my help. They wanted me to come back into the fold and clean up Jessica's mess. I told him flat out, I don't owe her anything. She made her bed, let her lie in it. He was silent for a moment, like he finally understood how deep the betrayal ran. Then, almost like a last-ditch effort, he said, look, maybe if you spoke to your parents, they'd listen. They'd give her another chance. And that's when I lost it. I leaned in and told him exactly what they'd said to me when I was kicked out, the words that had haunted me since. They looked me dead in the eye and called me a disgrace. They told me I wasn't welcome back, that I was nothing to them. So if they're looking for a savior, they should look somewhere else. His face turned pale. I think he realized that there was no winning me over, that I was done with all of them. He tried one last time, almost whispering, please, she needs you. The family needs you. I stood up, threw a few bucks on the table for my coffee, and looked him dead in the eye. No, she didn't need me when she was setting me up, and they didn't need me when they shipped me off with nothing. So now, I don't need them. I walked out without looking back. There was no way I was going to let myself get dragged back into their chaos. I'd built something out of nothing, found a way to survive on my own, and I wasn't going to let their guilt or desperation pull me back. I went back to my life that night feeling lighter. For once, I'd stood up for myself, faced them without any of the fear or shame I used to carry. I'd finally closed the door on that chapter, and I wasn't going to let them open it again. I thought that walking out of that cafe would be the end of it. I'd shut the door, burn the bridge, and finally put my family and Jessica out of my life for good. But as fate would have it, the universe wasn't done with my sister just yet. A couple of weeks went by and things were pretty much normal on my end. I'd go to work, save what I could, and focus on rebuilding. I figured my family would eventually realize that Jessica's life was crashing down around her, but that wasn't my problem anymore. She'd done enough damage to me. It was about time she dealt with the fallout on her own. Then one day, out of nowhere, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. Normally, I don't bother with unknown numbers, but something made me pick up. It was my mom. Just hearing her voice threw me off balance for a second because, up until now, they'd all been radio silent. She launched into this sob story about how the family was in crisis and how Jessica was really struggling. I could almost hear the desperation in her voice, like she was barely holding it together. Turns out, Jessica's problems were a lot bigger than her husband had let on. The investigation into her counterfeit business had gotten serious, and the authorities were all over her case. It wasn't just about her business either. Since my parents had invested a lot of money in her success, they were now under scrutiny too. Apparently, the family assets were at risk of being frozen, and they were looking at potential fines, or worse. Mom was practically pleading with me to understand, saying that they were all in this together, and that the family needed to stick together. I almost laughed. For years, they'd treated me like an outsider, like some kind of failure, and now that their golden girl was crashing, they suddenly remembered I was part of the family. I kept my cool and let her talk, but honestly, every word was just making me angrier. She said things like, "We're all hurting," and "Jessica made a mistake, but she's still family." The nerve of it! They didn't even care to hear my side when Jessica had set me up, but now that they were the ones paying the price, they wanted me back in the fold. When she finished, I told her flat out, "You all made your choice. You threw me out without a second thought, took Jessica's side without question, and now you want me to come back and play happy family? Sorry, but I'm done." She was quiet for a moment, and then she started crying, really laying it on thick. I think she thought I'd cave if she showed a little emotion, but I wasn't falling for it. I told her, "You should have thought about all this before you decided I wasn't worth a second chance." I hung up after that and felt this massive weight lift off my shoulders. They'd made their bed, now they could lie in it. And I was perfectly fine watching from the sidelines while they dealt with the mess Jessica had created. Over the next few weeks, word got around about Jessica's situation. Small towns have a way of making everyone's business public, and soon enough, everyone knew. People started whispering, questioning her success, and the clients she'd once bragged about disappeared almost overnight. She'd gone from being the it girl to the subject of every local gossip session. One day, I ran into an old friend who still kept in touch with some mutual acquaintances. She told me that my parents' assets had been temporarily frozen because of Jessica's investigation. Apparently, my parents were panicking, trying to salvage what they could, but their reputation was already shot. They'd gone from being one of the most respected families in town to the center of a scandal. Part of me felt bad, but mostly I felt a strange satisfaction. They were all getting a taste of what they'd put me through. The feeling of being betrayed by someone you trusted. The shame of public humiliation. It was like karma had decided to pay a visit, and I was sitting front row watching it all go down. Jessica's husband tried reaching out a few more times, probably hoping I'd have a change of heart, but I ignored him. I'd given them my answer. I wasn't about to get pulled back into their mess, especially not for someone who'd gone out of her way to ruin my life. Besides, they had made it clear what they thought of me when they kicked me out. Now it was my turn to make it clear that I wasn't coming back. And then came the cherry on top. One day, a mutual friend from the workshops I'd been attending mentioned a business grant program for small business owners who had overcome adversity. She said it almost like a joke, like, "Hey, you'd probably qualify for this after everything you went through." I laughed it off at first, but then I thought, why not? I had nothing to lose. I applied, figuring it was a long shot, but a few months later, I got the news. I'd been awarded the grant. The money wasn't huge, but it was enough to give me a fresh start. For the first time since my business had collapsed, I had real hope. I decided to start a small online shop with the grant money, focusing on handmade items. It wasn't much, but it was mine. No family ties, no strings attached, just me, finally building something on my own. I didn't tell anyone in my family about it. They'd already done enough damage, and I didn't need their approval or validation. This was my second chance, my redemption, and I was going to do it my way. Since then, I've put my heart into making this business work. I've learned from my mistakes, from every painful experience they put me through. And honestly, I'm grateful for it now. If Jessica hadn't betrayed me, if my parents hadn't turned their backs, I might still be wrapped up in their toxic mess, begging for their approval. Instead, I was free. Free to live my life without their judgments, without constantly feeling like I had to measure up to someone else's standards. I don't know what's going to happen to Jessica and the rest of them, and I don't particularly care. From what I've heard, her legal troubles are far from over, and my parents' finances have taken a big hit. They're all tangled up in each other's lives, dragging each other down, and I'm finally out of it. Sweet, sweet karma.